Just talking musicals with you.
Hello, I'm Lesley Ann Knight and welcome to Just Talking Musicals. Call me old-fashioned, but I've always been fascinated by the stories that lurk behind the scenes of all the classic Broadway musicals. A little while ago, I was doing some research into how Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II's 1927 musical Showboat came about. When I was growing up, I had seen the 1951 MGM Technicolor film starring Catherine Grace and Ava Gardner and Howard Keel, and it was electrifying from the start. Beautiful music, singing and dancing, all mixed up with an enthralling story. My young head just assumed Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein had just come up with this story for their musical. Thankfully, my slightly older head started to do some detective work. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, since the beginning of the 20th century, many of the old buildings around Broadway and Times Square, like huge foundation stones for display signs advertising popular drinks, cigarettes, underwear and ice cream, advertisers and theatre owners quickly discovered that coloured bulbs burnt out much faster than clear ones, and so the entire area came to be illuminated with these huge bright white lights. By night, the false daylight that they made brought a new kind of glamour to the district and earned it the title, The Great White Way. As the 1920s got underway, these Broadway theatres were thriving and numbered close to 80 in total as the decade got into its stride. This was the Roaring Twenties, and Broadway was fast becoming one of the most influential theatre districts in the world. Now, it had long been the practice for playwrights and producers to open a new show out of town, to try it out and make sure everything worked well, prior to effectively laying themselves bare, not just in front of a discerning Broadway audience, but more important, to the finely honed senses of the theatre critics. And it was one such show which had a pre-Broadway tryout booked at the rarely used Lyceum Theatre in New London, Connecticut, one hot summer's evening in August 1924. The play in question was called Minnick, based on the short story Old Man Minnick by the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Edna Ferber. For Broadway, Ferber had teamed up with fellow writer, director, humorist and all-round leading light of the theatre George S. Kaufman, who incidentally would himself go on to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes for drama of his own over the course of his career, one being the first ever awarded to a musical. But alas, even with such an illustrious writing team at the helm, out-of-town tryouts were indeed proving to be very trying. According to Ferber's memoirs, with 2 rather unsuccessful tryouts in New Haven and Hartford behind them, they arrived in New London, Connecticut for their next engagement at the Lyceum. As the stage lights clicked on at curtain up that evening, it became clear just how scarce performances must have been at this theatre. Because as the house lights went down and the brilliant illumination of the stage lights flickered on, a horde of bats swept down from high up in the ceiling dome and started to flit, swoop and dive above the heads of the by now, rather understandably, very alarmed audience, as they fled in horror from the theatre as fast as they could with scarves and programmes over their heads, before they'd even seen a second of the play. In the words of Edna Ferber, that the company went on with the performance and actually finished it was nothing short of heroic. At the end of the evening, the company all met at their producer Winthrop Ames's hotel suite for what must surely have been a slightly hysterical post-mortem of their evening's experience. They may have had a tough night, but they could laugh it off together at least. Winthrop Ames was a highly respected Broadway producer, and Edna Ferber later remarked that if Minnick had brought me nothing more than the friendship of Winthrop Ames, I'd have been overpaid for my work, time, energy or creative effort spent on it. And so it was, in an attempt to cheer up his dispirited company that evening, Ames turned to the assembled throng in his hotel room that night and said, "Never mind, boys and girls, next time I'll tell you what we'll do. We won't bother with tryouts. We'll charter a showboat and we'll just drift down the rivers, playing the towns as we come to them, and we'll never get off the boat. It'll be wonderful." And intrigued, Edna Ferber shot back with, "What's a showboat?" Ames went on to explain that as far back as the early 1800s, showboats used to play up and down the southern rivers. But now it seemed, with the arrival of movie theatres and the new wireless radio, that they were simply going out of fashion. These wonderful old showboats would toot their loud calliope horns as they arrived at each new town, and people would know for miles around that the showboat folks were in town again, ready to give them their latest show. These showboat actors slept, ate and worked on the boat, and all they had to do was stop at each town landing alongside the great rivers and go about the neighbourhood rustling up an audience for their show. Edna Ferber was so taken by this idea. In her own words, "It was one of the most melodramatic and gorgeous bits of Americana that had ever come my way. It was not only the theatre, it was the theatre plus the glamour of the wandering, drifting life, the drama of the river towns, the mystery and terror of the Mississippi itself." Ferber excitedly went back to New York with this new idea buzzing in her head. As for Minnick, despite the rickety start, it made it to Broadway and ran for 141 back-free performances. Meanwhile, Edna Ferber launched herself into the new Showboat project, hunting down every scrap of information she could possibly find about these fascinating floating theatres. Quite early on in her search, she heard about a working showboat that was on its way to North Carolina. Eager to learn all she could and determined to try and spend some time on one of these boats, she packed her bags and made the 500-mile journey down to North Carolina to try and catch up with the boat, determined to experience life on board at first hand. The particular gem in question was the James Adams Floating Palace Theatre, owned by two former trapeze artists, James Adams and his wife Gertie. As Ferber walked up the gangplank and onto the boat, she introduced herself to Charles Hunter, James Adams' brother-in-law, the stage manager and leading man, who was married to Beulah Adams, who was James Adams' younger sister and the Floating Palace's notable leading lady. As it turned out, both Charles and Beulah were big fans of Ferber's stories and were only too delighted both to make her acquaintance and to extend a cordial invitation for her to join them for their next season the following April, sailing out from Bath, North Carolina. That spring, Ferber excitedly joined the company on board the James Adams Floating Palace Theatre and spent what she came to describe as 4 of the most enchanting days she had ever known. In that short space of time, she worked, rehearsed and even sold tickets from the little box office window on board. And then, on her last day, she and Charles Hunter sat down to talk about life on the river. According to Ferber, they sat together on that showboat from early in the morning until way after dinner time, as he recounted the tales, dramas, tragedies, river lore, theatrical wisdom and general ups and downs of life on a showboat. And Ferber, like a willing student, sat by him with her pad of yellow copy paper writing copious notes. She described it as a stream of pure gold, and by the time he finished talking that evening, Ferber said she had a treasure trove of showboat material, human, touching, true. I was and am in his everlasting debt. So just 1 year later, in 1926, Edna Ferber's magnificent new novel Showboat was published. Showboat chronicled the lives of 3 generations of a theatrical family who perform and live on their Mississippi River showboat, the Cotton Blossom Floating Palace Theatre. The story is at once compelling in its portrayal of loyalty and love, for family and for friendships, highlighting as it goes the fight against racism, the perils of alcoholism, gambling, and one man's desertion of his wife. With such high drama at its core, it seems fairly unsurprising in hindsight to learn that Showboat went on to become one of the best-selling books of 1926, and on the very first page of the first edition, there was a most touching dedication, easily missed by an avid reader keen to get to the story, but so well worth treasuring and spending a moment's quiet reflection. It read, "To Winthrop Ames, who first said Showboat to me." In our next episode, we'll be looking into the true and/or apocryphal tale of how Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein II came to meet in a churchyard, and of course, much more importantly, how they went on to turn Edna Ferber's novel into one of the most famous musicals of all time. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Lesley Ann Knight, and behind the camera is the wonder that is this show's producer and director, Katie Ridout.
Hello.
Hello over there. You can find Just Talking Musicals on Facebook, and we're lurking on Twitter as well under the name of @KnightandRidout. Oh, and pretty please, don't forget to press the subscribe button for each new episode alert so you can bag the best front row seats for each new show. See you here again very soon for another instalment of Just Talking Musicals. Bye.
Just talking musicals, musicals with you.
Ah.